In meeting the people of the diocese, I was working on faith-based films. They knew and understood that I had my own background in immigration. I did grow up. I was undocumented coming to this country. I came here when I was 2 years old, and we came on a student visa, and with my mom, we wound up overstaying. And it was during the Reagan administration that we actually were able to adjust our status. And I say this keeping completely in mind that Reagan and the administration that we're living in right now have one thing in common, right? They were both the Republican administration. And thanks to Reagan for changing the laws in those times, because otherwise I really don't know where our legal status would be at this point. So the diocese knew that I had my immigration story. And when this opportunity came up to leave the entertainment world behind and come work in ministry, I prayed about it a lot. Very different going from Hollywood to this kind of world and working on mission-based work. But I embraced it, and I love it, and I love everything I do, and I can't think of ever doing anything else. In my capacity at the diocese, I oversee immigration affairs. Archbishop Jose Gomez being the leader of our church here in Los Angeles. Keep in mind that the Diocese of Los Angeles represents approximately 5 million Catholics, registered Catholics. And I say registered because we don't know how many are not registered. But it is the largest diocese in the country. And also, on any given Sunday, we have Mass in about 40 different languages. So it's also safe to say that we are probably one of the most diverse Catholic dioceses in the country. That said, obviously, it's Los Angeles, and we have an incredible amount of culture in this city. So Archbishop saw the need and the importance of making sure that we had an office dedicated to the topic of immigration and everything having to do with resources, advocacy, work, anything that we can do to be there for people that need the help, especially knowing that they can come and trust in the church for everything having to do with matters that are so sensitive and so personal to them. So in this capacity, I have 3 basic purviews. One is to provide resources to our community. And think of me as a traffic cop, if you will, for anything having to do with immigration. I'm not a lawyer. I do know a fair amount about immigration only because, again, of my own personal experience. And I've kept up with things that are happening both in policy and with laws and how laws change. But most importantly, I like to say that I have a great repository of all of the things that somebody would need in whatever kind of immigration crisis they may be in, whether it's a new arrival or somebody looking to just adjust their status and go into citizenship. And it's very complicated. I think there's 2 most complicated forms of law in this country are immigration and income tax law. So if just to give you some context, under income tax law, you have 4 different types of professionals that you can hire. A tax attorney, a CPA, a tax preparer like you would, with like an H&R Block or anybody else. Or you could also do your taxes on your own if it's simple and basic enough. But for an immigrant, any kind of legal representation, really, truly, you could only go to an immigration attorney. Maybe somebody who's BIA certified, and that's still under the purview of an attorney. But if you can think in terms of context, the disparity between people who need that kind of help and the access to financial resources to pay for an attorney, that's really tough. So that's where many of our partners come in, like Catholic Charities, and they provide and help those resources with the communities on an as-needed basis. So first is resources. Second is advocacy. Before the pandemic, usually about once a year, we would travel up to Capitol Hill and speak on behalf of the church and where we stand and where we are, and trying to push and trying to get both of our political parties to come together and try to work towards some kind of reform. Obviously, that's been very difficult these past couple of years. Hopefully soon we'll look towards some kind of change and some kind of reform. We're never going to give up. We're going to continue to keep pushing for this. But we also do this knowing that there's tons of stories within our church that we can highlight, that we can advocate for, and we can use those to truly kind of underscore the importance of pushing for reform. We also work at a local level with our city officials on all types of programs that are available and accessible to the immigrant community. work very closely with the mayor's office here in Los Angeles, as well as our county representatives. And anytime we see something, even if it involves some form of injustice, we recently had a program where we were going after people that were abusing of people that were applying for different types of status changes and using notarios, people who aren't necessarily legally bound and available to work on these cases. And we did that in conjunction with the county reporter's office here in Los Angeles. So partnering with them to get an educational component out and also providing any access to resources or information for people that may be breaking those laws. And then third is the educational component. And I think for me, that's probably been one of the most important components of my office is this knowledge and understanding that there's people you would think were the Catholic Church as people that would open their hearts to the understanding of the importance of being there in solidarity with our immigrant community, but that may not necessarily always be the case. So I help the immigrant community in understanding their role and responsibility for adapting here in Los Angeles when they do arrive. But I also take time to be a little bit more empathetic and talk to those people who may not understand the needs of the immigrant community. That was really an eye-opening moment for me when I came to work at the diocese. I want to share a quick little something to kind of provide some context on how I came up with this. I realized quickly that there was a lot of people in our parishes that were pro-immigrant. Great, fantastic. I also noticed there was a lot of people that are very anti-immigrant, and this sentiment was tough for me. I didn't really understand it, and I would say that there's a variance in extremism in those two areas. And if ever I try to get into these conversations between pro and anti, I just wound up going around in circles because people believe what they believe, right? And obviously, it hasn't helped that this administration has been very aggressive about its changes in policies and how it treats immigrants. So that made it very, very difficult to have these conversations. And then I stood back and realized that there would be these moments where things would happen, right? Things like the border crisis, when the families were being separated at the border. Or if you recall, when that little child, and I think it was a young girl and her father, were found face down at the river trying to cross the US-Mexico border. And these were moments where all of a sudden people kind of opened up their hearts and realized that there was things that were going wrong in society. And I realized that many of these people knew nothing about immigration, right? They would reach out to me or to other people to try to get more information. So as I started doing my work, I realized there was more and more people that knew a lot about immigration, or everything about immigration, as I would like to say. And I think Alexia is one of those people, which is why I appreciate her so much. So I realized that it was my goal, in my role and in my responsibility, to take these people going from nothing and trying to move them over every single time that something emotional happened in the news space, trying to bring them over to understand as much as they possibly could, right? Because if I try to change their point of view when they're anti-immigrant, it's like trying to convince them that they're wrong. And nobody wants to admit that they're wrong. But if I can move them over from not knowing and not understanding the topic of immigration and being a little bit more empathetic about what it means to be an immigrant and bringing them over, that's a much easier conversation and a much better way of approaching the topic to make sure that people understand that ultimately we're all here together as a community. And under what the church teaches us, it's our responsibility to care for one another. So just a little bit about what I do. That's my time. But please, again, if there's any resources, if there's anything else that you guys need or anything else that we can be helpful for, by all means, please, we're here to help.
Well, thank you so much, Isaac. And exactly on time. That was pretty impressive. Our next panelist is Rabbi Aryeh Cohen. He is the rabbi in residence at Ben the Ark Jewish Action. He is the Kagod Senior Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, and he is a professor of rabbinic literature at the American Jewish University.
Thank you, Alexia. So people might be asking themselves, what is a rabbi doing in a missiology conference? And the very simple answer is Alexia. Thank you, Alexia. I want to give two perspectives, a religious perspective and kind of a historical perspective on the Jewish community, Judaism, and immigration. Judaism is a religion whose basic narrative is a diasporic arc. As you all know, Abraham is born outside the land of Israel. Then Abraham, and on the order of God, moves to the land of Canaan. And the rest of Abraham's story, and subsequently Isaac's story and Jacob's story, is moving around as a result of famine and being a refugee in one part of either the land of Israel or Philistine or Egypt. Jacob and his family end up in Egypt following Joseph. And then there's a little story there, but there are a couple of movies about that, so we don't have to go into that. Israel then, as we know, ended up in Canaan. And this paradigm, then Israel, of course, the first temple was destroyed. Israel, the Jewish people were exiled to Babylonia, came back, second temple. And then in what called started for the last 2 millennia, this paradigm has repeated itself over and over. The history of the Jewish people for the last 2,000 years is a history of migration and refuge. The Judaism that is practiced today and the Jewish tradition that we observe and hold dear is a tradition that was created in the land of Israel and in Tunisia, in Spain, in Franco-Germany, in Poland, in Germany itself, in Morocco, in Yemen. Most Jews throughout history were at least diglossic. They spoke at least 2 languages. They spoke the language of the country they were in, and they spoke or at least read Hebrew, and they often spoke some sort of a Jewish language, like Yiddish is Jewish German, Ladino is Jewish Spanish. Because they were a people who lived both where they lived and they lived in Judaism, both in the texts and in the community and in the hope of the return to the land of Israel. Today, we are in an anomalous situation where there is as large a community, a Jewish community in the land of Israel, in Israel-Palestine, as there is outside of the land of Israel. But that's a very anomalous situation for the last 2,000 years. And so Judaism is very informed by this story of refuge and migration. And it also, one of the basic religious symbols is a symbol of Abraham and Abraham's tent, open to 4 sides, welcoming refugees, welcoming bypassers along the road. And Maimonides, one of the greatest of the Jewish philosophers and jurists and thinkers, cites Maimonides as the reason, the foundation for the fact that Judaism has a basic commandment to both welcome and give refuge to those who are seeking asylum, whether it is in his time slaves that are running away from their masters, or people who are running away from oppression. Even in the going back to the Talmud, which is in a 7th century text, going back, there are laws that deal with people who have to run away because of oppression and leave their property behind. These were the practical necessities of life in the Jewish community. On the historical side, the Jewish, in terms of dealing with refugees, all Jews have a refugee or immigration story in their family from 1, 2, or 3 generations ago. My family, on my side, my grandparents came to the United States during and after World War I, which was really lucky because they came from Poland. And if they had not gotten out then, they would have been there during the Holocaust. A lot of my grandmother's family was destroyed, was killed during the Holocaust. But we were lucky. Most of them came over. Ellis Island is kind of the iconic place that people from Europe landed in the United States. But when I went there, I couldn't find my family, and I spoke to my grandparents. It's because most of us actually didn't come over in steerage. There was one family member who got there early and sent back tickets, and therefore most people came over in first class, except for my grandfather, who was an illegal immigrant and undocumented. Where he stowed away on a ship, got off in Canada, and walked across the Canadian border and got to the United States that way. Luckily, the immigration laws were a little laxer back then, or more welcoming in that time. the Jewish community has always seen an obligation for itself in the United States as responsible to Jews around the world. And the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society was founded in 1881 to assist Jews who were fleeing pogroms in Russia and in Eastern Europe. Then at the end of the 19th century, there was a time of great ferment in Eastern Europe, and especially in Russia. They have continued operating for these past 140 years. For a long time, it was bringing Jews over from Europe, from Eastern Europe. There was a period of dormancy after, in the 50s and 60s, something of a period of dormancy, and then they started helping resettle Jewish refugees from the Soviet Union. Nowadays, most of what HIAS does is advocacy and resettlement on behalf of immigrants and refugees who aren't Jewish. And they say now, we advocated for refugees because they were Jews, and now we advocate for refugees because we are Jews. And we feel that both religious and historical obligations. I just want to talk a little bit about how the advocacy field in Los Angeles. There's a wonderful interfaith advocacy network in Los Angeles, which has been around for a while, but really came to a head before, or sprung into serious action, went into overdrive, whatever the metaphor is, right after the election of Donald Trump. And we came under, it consisted of a lot of different organizations, anchored by my organization, Bend the Arc, CLU, the Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, Sanctuary and Sacred Resistance, which is of the Episcopal Diocese, along with Matthew 25 and MPAC and a number of other organizations, HIAS, of course. And starting right after the election, we got together and we started advocating for Los Angeles to become a sanctuary city and for California to become a sanctuary state, meaning we were advocating for the fact that no law enforcement would get involved with immigration law. And our first major action was kind of iconic for what the interfaith immigration landscape looked like. We had an action which was on Easter, which fell out on Passover, and was also a Muslim holiday, the midnight travel of Muhammad, and also happened to be a Sikh holiday. And so we had portions of each of these. We had portions of a Seder, portions of the Mandamos, portions of the foot washing, and outside the Metropolitan Detention Center, in the demand that actually we become a welcoming and open city, and not a city that puts people in the detention center. And we had several hundred people there. 36 clergy were arrested in an act of civil disobedience, blocking the driveway that the ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement vehicles used to bring detainees to the Metropolitan Detention Center and bringing them out to deport them. And so beginning there, we've been advocating as an interfaith coalition for humane immigration policies. Of course, CHIRLA, very much that's in their name, humane immigration policies, both in Los Angeles, in California, and the United States. Because when when Trump said that he was going to send the army down to the border, all people of faith, and the Jewish community amongst them, knew that if we were a well-functioning country, we would be sending down doctors and social workers and aid workers, trying to figure out what people coming north actually needed, and not sending down soldiers. And I just want to finish off, and I realize I'm coming up to the end of my time, but I wanted to finish off with sharing a resolution that the conservative movement, one of the three main Jewish denominations, passed on immigration. Whereas Torah teaches, you shall not turn over to his master a slave who seeks refuge with you from his master. He shall live with you in any place he may choose, among the settlements in your midst, wherever he pleases. You must not ill-treat him. Whereas Maimonides taught that this commandment is given to us to make us protect and defend those who seek our protection and not deliver them over to those from whom they have fled. It is not even enough to protect those who seek your protection, but you are under another obligation toward him. You must consider their interests, be beneficent toward them, and not pain their heart by speech. Whereas Maimonides further taught that this law is imposed upon us in regard to all who seek refuge, regardless of their relative status in society. Whereas the American Jewish community knows both the enormous benefits that have accrued to us as a result of being accepted as immigrants and refugees into the United States, and also the grievous pain when Jews fleeing from Nazi Germany were refused entry to the United States and were returned to perish in the concentration camps and gas chambers. And then skip down, therefore it be resolved that the Rabbinical Assembly, in line with its support for a fair immigration policy and the guarantee of due process in immigration proceedings and the protection of civil liberties of immigrants, supports the creation of sanctuary cities across the United States, and which will not cooperate with Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the involuntary deportation of undocumented residents. And be it further resolved, the Rabbinical Assembly urges cities and states to set aside resources which will guarantee access to counsel to ensure due process for all those involved in deportation proceedings. And be it further resolved, the Rabbinical Assembly support the extension of DACA until such a time as a path to citizenship is created. And be it further resolved that the Rabbinical Assembly support a broad immigration reform which would allow the 11 million undocumented residents of the United States a path to citizenship. And be it further resolved, the Rabbinical Assembly oppose the creation of a deportation force or the channeling of extra funds to ICE, the Border Patrol, the National Guard, or other bodies that they become a de facto deportation force. And be it further resolved, the Rabbinical Assembly support the closing of detention centers where immigrants are held in prison-like conditions, despite the fact they are not charged with any crime. Be it further resolved, the Rabbinical Assembly opposes the use of private prisons for incarcerating undocumented immigrants. And as we say in our tradition, Ken Yiratzon, so should it be.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Aryeh. That was really beautiful. So our next panelist, we have such a richness here of panelists, is Nancy Yuen, and she is the Associate Professor of Sociology at Biola University. She has also appeared on PBS, NPR, NBC Nightly News, BBC World TV, Dr. Phil, New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times. And she is a guest writer at Newsweek, Elle, HuffPost, and Self. Take it away, Nancy.
And just playing off of Rabbi Aryeh, who said, what's a rabbi doing in a missiology? I'm like, what's a sociologist doing in a missiology? And it's all because of Alexia. So, and so a little bit of personal story. I too, like Isaac, am an immigrant. I came when I was about 5, so around the same time. And my mother, actually, so she was documented, and my father was documented by the time I came, but my mother was also undocumented and overstayed her student visa. So this is a common story. And I remember becoming naturalized when I was a teen, and it was complicated because I didn't have a birth certificate because there's a hospital birth certificate and they didn't accept that in the United States. So I had to go back and get the registry, or my grandmother had to send it, and they're like, it needs to be translated. I ended up translating it. Maybe I shouldn't, I don't know if they're going to revoke my naturalized citizenship, but I mean, I just phonetically translated. It was kind of, I felt like it was very ad hoc at the time. But everyone's got, we're a nation of immigrants. And so, and I felt, I think very much joining Matthew 25 was also around the time that Trump was elected, and feeling like this is the biggest humanitarian crisis of our time, that we are, that we were bracing for what did come to pass in terms of all the human rights violations. So this study that I'm going to be presenting on is brand new. This is actually the very first time anyone has presented from this study. And so we, a bunch of sociologists, and me and Brad Christensen, who's also part of this conference, and Alexia and Robert Chao Romero, we were all part of this project where we decided to look at Christian, specifically Christian, but of course, as we can see here, there's a bigger coalition, but this book project specifically on Christian organizations that are working with immigrants and now asylum seekers as well. And as we know, that immigration has kind of changed and altered as the laws have changed, and hopefully will change again when this new election comes around. And so we have interviewed 34 people, and we were looking at the organizations as well as the immigrants and asylum seekers that they are serving. And so we wanted to, I mean, the goal of the study is to kind of produce a best practice, like what these organizations have done well and what, or, the challenges that they faced and what they can do better. And so that's our thinking right now. So we're literally writing the chapters and possibly adding more interviews as we go on. And it's a Louisville-funded project as well. So, okay, so the chapters that we have right now, we're looking at racial, cultural issues, because I think we don't think about that enough, that, organizations, especially if there are predominantly white churches or white denominations serving predominantly brown populations, what are the racial, cultural issues that are arising in terms of misunderstandings or good intentions, but that are not working out, and just, all sorts of kind of cultural clashes. And we're also looking at how advocacy is being done. We're looking at how accompaniment is being done, as well as education, which has been mentioned. And today I'm going to be presenting on mental health and trauma that both migrants have experienced and what our organization is trying to do in order to serve these visitors. And so I'm going to start sharing. As a sociologist, we love data. So this is qualitative, so I won't be sharing any quantitative data, but these are from the interviews. So the talk title that I have come up with for this conference is Mama, Mama, they're going to get me trauma care for migrants. And the quote we'll see from one of the quotes in the migrants, it's a nightmare that this one particular immigrant is having, a recurrent nightmare of being deported. And so let's begin. Okay, so migrant trauma. So a lot of the immigrants that we have interviewed are coming from multiple layers of trauma, right? So not just trauma from their sending countries, but trauma along the way in terms of getting to the United States, trauma in the detention centers, and then of course, trauma in adjusting to this host society. So we're just gonna look at a couple of stories. So one is from Mateo. So these are pseudonyms that I created. Mateo is a 29-year-old from Nicaragua. And he says, I have to forget everything that has happened because bringing those memories along would be worse than torture. Back in the early days of being in Costa Rica after escaping Nicaragua, I couldn't sleep because I would hear bullets, the boom, boom of bullets sounding off in my sleep. I couldn't sleep because I was traumatized from all that I had seen. The other night I dreamt that they deported me and I was yelling, Mama, Mama, they're going to get me. And there they were waiting for me in the airport to deport me. So I woke up really frightened. I live with this traumatic fear that they're going to do something to me. And so the pastor said to me, we're going to do whatever possible to find you psychological help. So this is just one story. Beyond this, in the chapter, he talked about how he had a friend that he was protesting. He had a friend who said, I don't want to die before we see Nicaragua free. And then that same day he died because of gunshot wounds. And so, and poor Mateo witnessed all of this, right? So this is all just from the sending country and also along the way, right? Because he left from Nicaragua to Costa Rica. So this is already one removed. And the many countries, I don't think Americans think about this, that there are many, they're stopped at Mexico. There's so many kind of different paths that they are taking, and each one along the way. I mean, Mateo was also pursued by people from Nicaragua, still pursuing him and with violence. And so, anyway, it goes on and on in terms of the level of trauma. And this is Beatriz. She's from Honduras, and she says, and she's talking about detention. So this is another layer, right? And so she calls sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, my high school Spanish, forgive me, Hilera. I believe this is translated to icebox, which is a name given to detention centers. So she says, when I entered into the Hilera, they took everything away from me, my passport, because I had a passport, my cell phone, and now I don't have one. And two officers are coming, and the one who touched me was like, she's a woman, but I don't know what planet she's from. I don't know. She started treating me badly. Do you have lice? She tells me, no, I say. She didn't tell me to take everything off. She just took it off from me and threw them in the trash and degraded me like that, like some kind of animal. I think they treat animals better than us. She started to say that we are invaders to insult us. So this is just one snippet. She also, just to give you a little more background, she came from an abusive household. She was raped by her husband and a lot of violence. So it's just, again, multiple layers. And these are the migrants that actually, I think, were self-reflexive enough to talk about their trauma. So not every person that we interviewed was able to talk about it in this way. So these are just, but I think that this is very representative of the kind of trauma that people are coming from. And a lot of it is from the actual detention centers as well. So we are responsible for that as well. And so besides migrant trauma, so we were also interested when we asked organizations, what are they doing? We asked about mental health. And so I didn't type it out, but I just want to list some of the resources that we saw that organizations talked about. One organization has to deal with the local Christian seminary is what we're calling it. I may come up with another name, but you guys may know what this local Christian seminary is that has a professional psychology program. I just thought it was really, really clever that, so multiple organizations are working with this local Christian seminary, and one is getting nominal fee therapy sessions for $5, which is totally affordable, right? Sometimes the organization will actually cover it if migrants can't afford it, and even they're supposed. The organizer talked about even a child psychologist, right? So making house calls. So we have children, obviously, that also are part of the immigration stream, and so having specialized child therapists is very helpful. Another organization is also trying to actually make this local seminary a practicum site. So having a relationship so that the organization can send immigrants to this local seminary so that it could be part of their master's in science in marriage and family therapy. So ways to partner, right, with already resources that are already there in order to serve the mental health needs of these migrants. And so also another organization connects low-cost immigration legal services and referred out to mental health services, sliding scales, and then also another organization has support groups for undocumented individuals and families. So these are just people who are volunteering their time. And in these support circles, there are sometimes mental health professionals such as therapists and social workers, right? That support not just that particular circle, but maybe so there's lots of other circles that are connected so that they can serve, the kind of greater Southland. So these are some of the organizational resources that we found that seem to be working. But we also found that, so I think when we were thinking, I remember even with Matthew 25 thinking that when we started, it would be, helping with undocumented immigrants. But of course, now we have, another bigger, group of people that we're serving. But in terms of if it's undocumented immigrants, there might be family members, right? That might need help. And so I think we need to think beyond just kind of the immigrants themselves, but also what if the immigrants who are undocumented have U.S. citizen kids or family members that also need support. So we did talk to one person who wished that she had more. She was married to an undocumented immigrant, and so she herself wished that she had more mental health support. So that's one way that organizations can really help support families, because obviously, if my husband were undocumented and he was in detention center, I think that I would need a lot of mental health support. But that's not something that we think of immediately, right? We're thinking about let's get them out of detention. Let's do advocacy, but the mental health needs, they can have long-term effects, and also just are very much, this is a cost of our immigration system as well, right? Okay, and one thing that was surprising, I found, of course not surprising, but we also have to think about the organizations themselves and the staff, right? So the staff members who are serving, a lot of them, at least the ones that we've talked to, and the volunteers, they themselves might come from vulnerable populations. They themselves might have family members who also have come, are also undocumented, right? So this particular staff member talked about her, about how important it was to meet the mental health needs of people who are serving. So she says, her name's Maya. She says, for me as an organizer, it's personal because my family has been discriminated for being undocumented or for being immigrants or for not being the right color, and I think we do this out of our personal commitment, but we're never taught boundaries. We're never taught, how to healthily disassociate some of the trauma, or that we grow up with chronic PTSD because of the neighborhoods or the conditions, of where we were raised. And so sometimes they only teach us to use our pain and our anger to do the work, but they never teach us how to heal. They never teach us, in spite of our broken as of all this trauma that we've experienced because of white supremacy, besides the methods. So I think this is what leads to a lot of community organizers to burn out. So it's like, the people who are probably like, I think for me, I want to help because I'm an immigrant, right? And so having this immigrant background, but then also having the trauma, it's a lot, right? And of course, in this chapter, I try to argue that if organizers are not dealing with it healthily, then they're not help. It's like if you're like just powering through something, you're going to expect the immigrants to also power through. It's this kind of unhealthy circle, right? And so it's really also important to address the mental health needs of those who are serving. And so this is the research team: Brad Christensen, myself, Nancy Yuen, Alexia Salvatierra, and Robert Chow Romero. So we're just starting this. If any of you or anyone who's watching have suggestions, have other resources, because we're just beginning our project, where we welcome your suggestions and comments and questions, you can contact me by our emails. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. I don't tweet about this as much because actually my research is in Hollywood and racism. So this is a new project, and it's my passion in terms of who I think stories need to be elevated. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yuen. Our final panelist is Salam Al-Marayati, and he is the president and co-founder of the Muslim Public Affairs Council. So Salam.
Thank you so much, Alexia. Always good to be with you, and very honored that you invited us for this very, very important discussion. I want to pick up, everybody has said wonderful things. I want to pick up in particular what Isaac was talking about in terms of how do we move to a more common understanding of the problem, as opposed to looking at the issue of a conflict between anti and pro, which never gets us anywhere on any issue. And so from the Muslim perspective, I think there's a lot of background that needs to be understood. And there's a lot of misinformation and, in fact, disinformation, especially as it relates to Islam and Muslims. And I think for the Muslim issue, it's the canary in the coal mine type of situation, that what is happening with the Muslim immigration issue is basically a barometer of what is happening in terms of the overall sentiment. In fact, it's used and exploited to oppose immigration in general. But I think we have to understand it more. In 1994, there was Proposition 187. It was called the SOS Proposition, Save Our State Proposition, that denied basically public healthcare, public education, public services, social services to the undocumented. And at that time, the Islamic Center of Southern California, the LA Archdiocese, and the Board of Rabbis of Southern California issued a dissent, an amicus brief to the court, basically saying that we could not apply that in our houses of worship out of our religious principles, and therefore it's a violation of our freedom of religion to be imposed with that initiative. And I think this is part of the sanctuary movement as well, is that we feel that our houses of worship are open to anyone and everybody, the stranger especially, and the stranger and the persecuted is found in the gospel, in the Torah, in the Quran, and that it is our duty to do that. And for the country's strength and success is not measured by how we give more privileges to the rich and powerful. It's measured by how we take care of the vulnerable and the disenfranchised and the dispossessed. And that's something that was part of our country as well. I mean, for so long, America has been founded on the issue of being that refuge for the persecuted. That's the founders of our country built the Constitution around that principle. How do we oppose tyranny so that there aren't more persecuted people, and how do we take care of those who are persecuted? So that is something I think we can all agree on as Americans. Number two, I think another important aspect of our understanding is that this happens in cycles. In 1939, there was a ship named the St. Louis that had Jews who were fleeing persecution from Nazi Germany. And we, the United States, turned it away. And we're doing the same thing over and over again, I believe. So this is unfortunately a reflex reaction that we're dealing with. And we have to understand how to deal with it from a more conscientious standpoint. How do we develop a stronger consciousness on this issue? By the way, last year, there were 2 incidents involving attacks on houses of worship that Muslims and Jews were actually both involved in, and it had to deal with immigration. In Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life attack, the attack on the Tree of Life synagogue occurred, and one of the drivers was that the culprit believed that Jews were financing Muslims to come and enter our borders, our southern borders. And in Poway, the same thing was stated about the synagogue there in San Diego. And the same person that shot at Jewish worshipers in the synagogue was the person who tried to burn the mosque down in Escondido, just 10 miles away. So we see, unfortunately, the extremism on the anti-immigration side now express itself in very violent terms. And we have to understand it and counter it and work with our partners in developing a movement to deal with that problem. Now, as far as it relates to Muslims in particular, let us look at the drivers for what is happening. Why are we getting more refugees from Somalia, from South Asia, and even from China and from Bosnia? Well, these are Muslims who were attacked because they were Muslims. And the stereotypes that were used against them is, number one, they were not indigenous to the land. Bosnians were not really Bosnians. The Uyghurs are not really Chinese. The Kashmiris are not really Indian. The Palestinians are not really Palestinians. So you get that extremist rhetoric that these are foreign groups. The Bosnians were Turks, and the Muslims of Kashmir and India are really Arabs who came and tried to take over South Asia, and so on and so forth. So you get this notion that they're foreign. Number two, that they're intrinsic in the religion and the culture is violence. And number three, they're hostile to our country and they want a takeover. Now, what is common in terms of those drivers with every other group? It's that there is that commonality. That's what they said about Jews in Nazi Germany. That's what they say about the undocumented here. That's what they say about all these people who are persecuted. It's not really because you're Muslim or because you're Jew or because you're Christian. It's just because you present an obstacle to religious nationalism in those countries. And religious nationalism is not just religion. It's not even about religion. It's about using culture and or religion to gain power, and scapegoating is the easiest way to get to power. So that is really what we're all against. And then also for the Muslim issue, I think war has a big plays a big role in why we have refugees. Like when we look at Syria and Iraq, why are there refugees from Syria and Iraq? Because there's war. What's the United States' role in that war? Well, it played a big role in going to war in that area. Why are we having refugees from other parts of the world? Because the United States played a role in supporting dictatorships, in supporting authoritarian regimes, in exploiting the economic resources of those countries that created an economic, political, military situation that forced people to flee. And therefore, it is our responsibility as Americans to take care of that problem, either take care of the problem over there or have to deal with it over here. But making the immigrants themselves or blaming them for the problem is really part of the problem. And therefore, we have to speak to the higher level of our souls, of our nation, of our consciousness in addressing that problem. And that's what led to the travel ban against certain Muslim majority countries that President Trump issued in terms of an executive order. And the reality is, when he talked about these countries of not having the system to vet these immigrants, the United States vets all people who come to our country. There is a very thorough vetting process. And again, a part of the reason why those countries don't have a strong process as the United States is because either we as the United States went to war against those countries and basically destroyed the infrastructure, such as Iraq, in terms of what happened there, or we've just decided that we will turn our backs to the situation in that region. And all the countries that were banned, basically, not a single one of them sent somebody here that committed an act of terrorism. And as we know today, there's more of a problem of terrorism when it comes to domestic terrorism than when it comes to international terrorism. International terrorism is still a problem. We shouldn't diminish that concern at all. But to make it only a problem of people of color coming from overseas and not looking to the problem of terrorism within the United States, I think is a part of that exploitation. So I think we need to have conversations about all these issues, and hopefully we can come to a more common understanding, as Brother Isaac articulated very well. And we really look forward to working with Alexia and Arya and Nancy and everybody here on that call towards a more common understanding of this crisis that needs a faith-based response.
So these were, I'm sure everyone listening agrees that these were just really amazing, rich, dense presentations. We don't have questions yet, so I do want to really encourage people who are listening, please feel free. There are no dumb questions. Any question that you have is a good question. Or if you have a comment, please put it in the question and answer session. I hope the tech is working, because not having any is a little strange. So I'm assuming that the tech is working. Just go to the question and answer session on Wova and put in your questions or comments. In the meantime, I'd like to know if any of the panelists would like to respond to any of the panelists. If there's something that one of the other panelists said that struck you or that made you think of something that you'd like to add. We have about 11 minutes. And of course, if questions come up, I'll jump in and pull those questions. But in the meantime, is there anything you'd like to say to each other or add? Or questions that you have for each other even?
So I'd say something, just picking up on something that Salam said. I've gotten to know very closely a Honduran refugee, asylum seeker. And he speaks about, he was an environmental activist in Honduras Honduras is basically a narco state, and he crossed them because he was protesting against the deforestation, and it ended up that he was protesting in a site where they had an airplane, they had built an airport for bringing drugs in and out of the country. And so he was forced to flee, and he didn't actually want to come to the United States. But as Nancy related with the young man who came from, fled Nicaragua, he was followed to Mexico and had to come in the middle of the night to the United States. Part of the problem is that the president of Honduras is a friend of Trump's, right? And so the United States has a monetary relationship, an arms relationship with Honduras. And so therefore the president's brother was just indicted in the Southern District of New York. The president and is in the Senate, was extradited. The president is indicted, but was not extradited. And so when I went down to Central America, it seemed that we should have, there should be a sign over the American embassies in Central America where it said, "Screwing up Central America since the Teddy Roosevelt administration." And so one of the central notions of doing tshuva, of repentance and repair, is that we have a debt to these countries. We have a debt to the fact that we treated them as just extraction countries, as countries that had resources that we can take out of them, and then the rest of it didn't bother us. And as long as the countries were stable, and we know that the United States foreign policy has distinguished between our dictators and their dictators. And so I think that has to be part of the conversation. And Salam talked about that very eloquently also, and that has to be part of the conversation of what the United States, the collateral damage of United States foreign policy, and we have to take responsibility for that.
So we have two wonderful questions now, and we also have a comment saying thank you for the motivation. So everyone should feel good about that you motivated people. So I'm going to tell you the first question and the second question afterwards, because the first question is they're each powerful. So the first question is, wow, thank you all so much. What are some of the things you have learned about yourself or about your faith that has been enriched by working with people from other traditions? So what are some of the things you have learned about yourself or about your faith that has been enriched by working with people from other traditions?
I can jump in on that, Alexia. I think so. Yeah, a little more background. I grew up evangelical. When I came to this country, my mom wanted nothing to do with the old country, and even though I was baptized and confirmed as a Catholic as a baby in Mexico, I grew up evangelical here, and so it's not until 20 years ago that I became Catholic, and now there's some weird Catholic math where I'm more Catholic than my wife somehow. But everybody who's Catholic will get that joke. But I mentioned this because what I realized is that, especially with Catholicism, and I'm sure in other faiths, there's this urgency and this sense of defending life, namely the unborn, as something that's preeminent. And I've been in situations, even within our own Catholic churches, where I've been shouted down by people who are very pro-life, yet the minute that they hear that I'm working on immigration issues, they don't think my office should exist. They condemn everything that I do in my work. And these are Catholics. This is in a church. So I realized that if I didn't make it a point to reach out and try to understand that person, I could never truly get far in my own mission. So when I was shouted down by this pro-lifer in one of our meetings, we had a little breakout session, and everybody was supposed to pair up with somebody that they didn't know in the room. So I went right up to this person and said, "Hey, I'm Isaac. I want to know more about what you do for, pro-life issues." And she said, "Well, I go and I pray outside of abortion clinics." And, and I said, "Well, I've never done that. I'd be happy and thrilled to come with you one day." And she looked at me like I was crazy and couldn't believe that 5 minutes ago she was shouting at me because of my work. And here I am saying, let's go. I want to support you and what you do and understand, because ultimately defending all assets, all facets of life is important and should be important to anyone who's grounded in their faith and anybody who understands God, not just the unborn, but every single part of, and that includes immigrants. And if you're in that stage in life where as an immigrant, you need help because you're being persecuted, because you're a refugee, because of whatever reason, that's just as important as any other.
I just wanted to add, go ahead and ask the question.
Salam.
No, go ahead and ask the second question.
Take one more comment on this question, then we'll move to the next question. So go on, Salam.
Yeah, and also to build up on Isaac's point, to understand the other, what I've learned from every religion and an organization that works on immigration issues is, while we have different theologies, we have identical values. Mm-hmm. What are our values? It's about mercy. It's about compassion. It's about justice, equity. It's about human dignity. Is there any religion that opposes those values? And I think the conversations we need to have then should be more values-based in terms of those topics as it relates, and not so much as, religious differentiation or ethnic or racial differentiation that divides people further and further. And I think that's the challenge for all of us as faith-based organizations.
And actually what you just said, both of you, feeds into the next two questions. And I think that I can actually combine them. One of the questions says, what are some of the most effective strategies for educating people? Like you've all mentioned that there are people that you come into contact with who don't agree from your tradition. Even in the Jewish tradition with all the history that Arya shared. So what are some of the best strategies? And the other question is, what are the barriers that you face? And I think that they're linked, right? So if we can just quickly answer that, go on maybe in each person, just quickly answer, what are some of the barriers or myths that you deal with? And then what are the most effective strategies for educating that you've personally found? And maybe let's start with the two that haven't spoken right now, Arya and then Nancy, and then we'll go to the other two.
So I think about, there was the European refugee crisis, that it was the child, right? The picture of the child on the beach that really got people to really start to have compassion. And then when I read about it, that people feel overwhelmed, right? People may have compassion, but they feel overwhelmed by the crisis. So then they just kind of disassociate emotionally. And I think that that we need stories, right? I think stories, we know this, but I think that stories, single stories, because I guess the human capacity is limited. And so having those really powerful stories, because we need to humanize, right? We need a human face. Instead of, because I wanted to actually ask, since we don't have time, but maybe people can think about it in their answer. I'm curious about the religious, especially the conservatives, things calling out legality, right? That's their kind of counter argument that, well, they're suffering, but they're not supposed to be here in the first place. They're not here illegally. That's the kind of other moral kind of barrier that they push up against the kind of but these are suffering humans. Well, they're not supposed to be here. And so I think it's well, what story is it? What kind of story is gonna work without them kind of just dehumanizing or calling it, a breakage of law? So that's kind of my stories. But what happens when people don't want to hear them, right?
Right.
So I would say that in general, there is 25% of the Jewish community, 25% of the Muslim community and the Latinx community voted for Trump. So there is there are people who are there. There is a solid core of people who are anti-immigrant, and ironically, it's not necessarily people who themselves were born in the United States. Right. It's people, but it's the question of how do you get people to see other people's stories as their stories, as the same as their stories. It's not that your story is so different. You came from Russia, you came from Germany, you came from other people coming from Mexico, from Guatemala, or from El Salvador. I think that's what Nancy said is really important. It's also that it's not about, I think in the Jewish community, because of the trauma of the Holocaust, especially the Ashkenazi Jewish community, the trauma of the Holocaust, for a lot of very conservative, very Orthodox Jews, everything is anti-Semitism, right? And so for those who are not suffering from anti-Semitism, then there must be some reason that they want to. And I think it's really a way of listening, of hearing what Isaac just said, of hearing what other people are saying, and then reframing it. Saying, see, this is just like that. It's the same story. And once you get people to see that it's the same story, then I think it's not easy. Then I think you can move people to also empathize.
Isaac and Salam. We're actually at time, but we have a little flex. We're the last event of the day, so let's at least finish this question. We have 4 other questions, but let's at least finish this one.
Salam, go for it.
No, go ahead, Isaac.
I think briefly, again, kind of finding that commonality is key. It doesn't always just have to. I love all of this. This all sounds great, and yes, listening, key. Maybe finding common denominators like food, music. Our houses of worship are great places to kind of just bring that multicultural approach, right? Those are just really easy and simple strategies, especially now that everything has to be virtual. There's no reason why we can't work together and cross-collaborate and just try to get some listening sessions in to get people to understand things just a little better.
Salam.
Yeah, I want to talk about, I want to touch upon 2 very important issues. One is the economy. There's a driver that is telling people that we cannot afford to bring in more immigrants to the United States. And that is absolutely false. It's not that we don't have enough. It's that a very small percentage wants to have more. The top 1% are getting more and more, and the rest of society is trying to maintain that or actually suffering. And look at the pandemic as a result. We can't even deliver health security, economic security, housing security to the most vulnerable of our society, who are essential workers. So there is an inequity in our society aside from the immigration problem. And that has to be dealt with first before we can tackle the immigration problem of our country. And then we will realize more that we can afford to have, to absorb these immigrants, because we are a very rich country. It's how we're distributing our resources that's the key. And greed at the top, I think, is preventing us from seeing that. Number two, the other notion that, well, these people don't want to integrate into our society. I think that's a myth. Among the most willing people that want to be a part of the larger society is the immigrant population. They work hard, they contribute, they work at lower wages than the rest of us want to. Let's face that. That's why they're getting those jobs, and they're sacrificing. These are strong American values, and they want to be part of our community. In the case of the Jewish immigrants who came, fleeing Soviet persecution, we worked on a bill to help them resettle in the United States. We left that approach. We haven't done that since then, and we're looking at immigrants as not just something of a burden, but as an evil. And I think that's something that we have to deal with as religious communities, first and foremost.
So I'm going to take my hat off and just be part of the group just for a second here, because I want to throw a couple of things in. As I listen to everyone here, there are two categories that keep coming to mind. And one is reframe and the other is relationship. Reframe and relationship. And reframing really means stepping back and looking at the issue from some different angles and seeing new information in the process. So when someone says to me, what is it about illegal you don't understand? I always say, well, let's look at questions of appropriate punishment, that we have constitutionally a commitment to appropriate punishment, right? So there are all different kinds of people that break different kinds of laws. There are civil laws, and actually most of the immigration laws are civil law, not criminal law, right? So only in a few states do we have criminal law around immigration. Everywhere else it's civil law. So, you look at civil law and you look at what are the penalties for civil law. And then you look at some of the ways in which our immigration system has drastic punishments for minimal offenses. So it begins to reshift, some of the questions you've been talking about, Salam, about how do we use resources. There's an enormous amount of evidence that immigrants bring in more contributions economically than they take in a society, particularly over time. But you have to step back and see the big picture. Someone may come as a refugee with nothing, but then what do they end up contributing over the course of a lifetime? You might have to pay for an education, but then you're investing in that child. So again, this reframing, we're stepping back, big picture, looking at different angles, other kinds of information emerge. The relationship one, I love what you said a minute ago, and Nancy was talking about stories, and then Isaac was talking about food and music, and Arya said that beautiful piece about, how are our stories the same, right? If we get underneath the surface. I find that it's critical to build trust relationships between people. If you want someone to hear a new story or to hear the story in a more empathetic way, that requires a trust relationship. And in our faith communities, we have lots of options to build trust relationships. When you serve together, you build trust relationships in a way that you might not if you were just sitting across a table arguing. But you serve, like you talked earlier, Salam, about living our values. When you live your values side by side with someone, it builds a really profound bond. So I just wanted to take the hat off, put the hat back on. And I just want to thank all of our panelists for this amazing conversation.